St. Nicholas is to the Greek Orthodox what St. Peter is to Roman Catholics and what St. Patrick is to Ireland. So St. Nicholas is the most popular Greek Orthodox saint, and he lived during the Roman times. And so we're all familiar. St. Peter was crucified upside down in the Circus Maximus in the first century. Well, we're going to skip forward to the third century, and that's when Nicholas was born, around 280 AD, and he dies in 343 AD. Now, the Roman Empire obviously goes around the entire Mediterranean, and this is still during the persecution period of time. And so there were 10 major persecutions of Christians in the first 3 centuries, and Nicholas lived during the last and the worst. It was under Diocletian. He had lost some battles with Persia, and he asked his generals why, and the generals said, "You've neglected the Roman gods." And so Diocletian decides to order all the military to return to worshiping the Roman gods. And so Diocletian then uses his military to force the entire Roman Empire to return to worshiping the Roman gods. And he goes province by province, systematically tearing down churches and killing the church leaders and so forth. And so there's the major persecutions in the first 3 centuries. You have Nero, everybody's familiar with him, and he would wrap Christians in burlap and dip them in tar and put them on poles in his garden and light them on fire, Nero's torches. But a little bit before Diocletian, there was an emperor, Gallienus, in 260 AD, and he temporarily suspended the persecution of Christians. And so a revival broke out with a whole lot of the military returning to the becoming Christian. And when Diocletian becomes the emperor, as I mentioned, he loses these battles with Persia, and then he decides to clean out the Christians from the military, and then decides to go across the entire Roman Empire persecuting the Christians. So Nicholas is born around 280 AD. A movement was sweeping through the Christian church at the time called Pietism, a little before the monasticism movement. It was this idea that if you really became a Christian, you were expected to give away all your money and join a monastery, or live in a cave, or build a platform in the Egyptian deserts and climb on top and bake in the sun, thinking you're denying your flesh and getting holier. But it was all this me-focused salvation. Anyway, you have Nicholas is born. His parents died when a plague swept through town and left him with a lot of money. And so following this tradition, he went ahead and gave away his money. And he was in a town called Patara, Asia Minor, and that's on the southwest coast of modern-day Turkey. And so there was a merchant, and this merchant had gone bankrupt. And back then, the creditors would not only take your house and lands, they would take your children. I'm trying to move to make the more stable. And so there's a whole lot of 3rd, 4th, 5th century artwork of this merchant. So the story is the merchant had 3 beautiful daughters. He's bankrupt. The creditors are threatening to come and take not only his house and lands, but take his children, sort of sex trafficking and so forth. And so this merchant knew his daughters he had 3 beautiful daughters, knew if they were taken, it would be a terrible life. So he had an idea. He thought if he could hurry up and marry his daughters off, the creditors could not take them. Unfortunately, he did not have money for a dowry, which was needed in that area of the world for a legally recognized wedding. Well, Nicholas hears the problem and late one night throws the money in the window for the oldest daughter to get married for her dowry. It was a big buzz, talk of the town. And then he throws the money in the window for the second daughter. And she gets married. Big buzz, talk of the town. Again, a lot of artwork through these centuries of Nicholas throwing the money in the window and the 3 daughters. And then when he throws the money in the window for the 3rd daughter, by this time the dad is waiting up. And supposedly the money landed in a shoe or a stocking that was drying by the fireplace. And, and so the dad runs outside, catches Nicholas, and Nicholas makes the dad promise not to tell where the money came from. Because, again, he wanted the glory to go to God and not to himself. And so this was the origin of the tradition of secret gift giving on the anniversary of Nicholas's death, which was December 6th of 343 AD. And the stockings by the fireplace and sort of the anonymous gifts. It says he provided a dowry for 3 girls. Now, interestingly enough, he becomes considered the patron saint of pawnbrokers. You go, what? That's right. Pawnbrokers claim that they're helping families out in their time of need, and they have 3 gold balls that they traditionally hang outside of their shops to represent the 3 bags of gold that Nicholas threw in the window to rescue these 3 girls and their families in their time of need. So after Nicholas gives away all his money, he decides he is going to do the next step, join a monastery. So he takes a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he's about to join the monastery of Zion, but somehow the Lord tells him not to hide his light under a bushel. So he goes back to Asia Minor, to a city called Myra. It's a big port city. And unbeknownst to him, the bishop had died, and the church leaders could not decide who the next bishop was going to be. And the elderly church leader has a dream that the first person to church the next day would be named Nicholas, and he was to be their next bishop. And so, again, this is on the southwest coast of modern-day Turkey. And so there's this city of Myra. There's some ruins of it even to this day. And so Nicholas is the first one to church the next day. His habit was to fast all night, and then, matter of fact, that was the traditional church habit, and you wouldn't eat till after church, and they would have the break fast after church, and you couldn't receive communion until after, or couldn't eat till after communion type of thing. So Nicholas goes to church, walks in the door. They ask him his name. When he says Nicholas, they take him to where all the church leaders are praying, and they tell him the news that he is supposed to be their next bishop. Well, he was not too excited, because at this time the Roman Emperor Diocletian was arresting bishops and killing them. So it was sort of like, oh, you be the bishop. No, I insist, you be the bishop. No, you first. Right. Anyway, so he finally relents, and he agrees to be the bishop. And sure enough, he is arrested, and he's put in prison under Emperor Diocletian. And he spends several years there awaiting death. Well, in the meantime, the Emperor Diocletian is struck with an intestinal disease that's so painful, he abdicates the throne on May 1st, 305 AD. Now, you have to appreciate the poetic humor in this. By this time, Roman emperors had been declaring themselves a god and demanding that their image be worshipped, and they would sprinkle gold dust in their hair. So this was sort of like a god resigning. Anyway, the next emperor is Galerius, and he continues the persecution of Christians. He's struck with an intestinal disease and dies, so it must have been something in the water. Anyway, then it's a toss-up. So in Rome, when there wasn't a replacement emperor in line, the generals fought it out. And if a general thought he had a big enough army, he would declare himself the next emperor, and if you didn't like it, come and fight. So there were 4 generals, and they were quickly 2 defeated, and now it's down to 2 generals. And one is Maxentius, and the other is Constantine. And Constantine is in York, England, when word comes that the emperor died, and his men surround him and say, "Hail Caesar!" And they agree to march with him to Rome. And so Constantine comes to Rome and fights Maxentius. And it's the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 313 AD. And story is that Constantine saw the sign of Christ in the sky the day before the battle. And he puts it on all of his shields and symbols and wins. And so he legalizes Christianity. Now, the sign of Christ is traditionally thought to be the first 2 letters of the Greek name for Christ. So Christus, is a Latin word coming from the Greek, and the Greek spelling of it, the letter that makes the K sound is spelt as an X. It's called a chi. And the letter that makes the R sound, is written as a P, but it's called Rho. So it's the Chi Rho, are the first 2 Greek letters for the name of Christ. Sort of like we abbreviate states with the first 2 letters oftentimes. Anyway, so if you've seen 4th century Christian artwork, you'll see this big X with a P on top, and it's called the Chi Rho. And Constantine supposedly heard the words "en tuo nica," which also in Latin is "in hoc signo vinces," and that means in this sign you'll be invincible. And sure enough, he wins the battle and becomes the emperor. He legalizes Christianity, puts this Chi Rho on all of the 4th century Christian artwork with the letters IHSV in hoc signo vinces, and this sign will be invincible. Over the centuries, it just got shortened to the chi, which is the X, and it was called the Christ's cross or the crisscross because it makes the K sound, the first letter for the name of Christ. And then we see the abbreviation Xmas, and we think, oh, they're crossing out Christ. No, that's the Greek letter that stood for Christ. And then it became the form of a written oath where you'd sign at the Christ cross. You'd in a court, you'd lift your hand, put your other hand on a Bible, swear to tell the truth, so help you God. Well, if you're signing a document, you would sign at the Christ cross, giving your word that you were going to keep your pledge. And that's come down to us as signing at the X. And then they would kiss it to show sincerity. And that's come down to us as the X's and the O's on the bottom of a Valentine. The X to show your pledge of sincerity, and then the kiss to show you your affection. And then it also cross your heart. Remember the little, kids, I swear, tell the truth, across my heart. Well, what's that? Well, that's the Christ cross.
Gotcha.
Anyway, a little bit of trivia there. Anyway, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, officially ending the persecution of Christians, and this is when Nicholas is let out of jail. And how am I doing time-wise?
Oh, you're doing fantastic. You just take all the time you want, Bill.
Okay, and so Nicholas is let out of prison, and now that it's okay to publicly be a Christian preacher, he decides to preach against pagan practices like human sacrifice. It was called exposure of unwanted infants, basically their version of abortion. So the tradition in Rome was when a mother bore the child, she would lay it at the father's feet. If he picked it up and liked it, they would keep it. If he didn't pick it up or didn't think they could afford it, she would have to put the baby in a box and set it outside of the door and expose it to the elements, and it would die. And the early Christians would hear these babies crying and rescue as many as they could. And also, Nicholas preached against divination. What's that? Well, these Romans, they would go through years of classes to study a liver or a gizzard. And so they would want a fortune teller. And they would cut open animals and look at their innards to try to predict the future. Nicholas preaches against this. And so he ended up being a fiery preacher. Well, one of the other things he did was preach against sexual immorality. So nearby was the temple to Diana at Ephesus, and it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It had 127 huge pillars and temple prostitutes. It was the Las Vegas of the Mediterranean, the temple to Diana, and it had this little multi-breasted idol image. And even the Apostle Paul preached at Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. And all the people, said, "Great is Diana, the goddess of the Ephesians," and then he ended up having a revival there. So Nicholas preaches against it, and the people tear the temple to Diana down. So we know a couple things about Nicholas. He was a Christian. He went into the ministry. He was generous, gave to the poor, and he was imprisoned for his Christian faith. And now he's out publicly preaching against sexual immorality and exposure of unwanted infants and so forth. Then there's the Arian heresy. The first heresy to split the Christian church. What was it? Well, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, Christians didn't live long enough to argue over doctrine. They would be thrown to the lions and so forth. Once Constantine legalized Christianity, you had more time on your hands, I guess, and so then they began to argue over doctrine. And a guy named Arius said that Jesus was a little less than God. He was a created being. Arius makes this catchy tune, and a whole lot of the Visigoths, who were some of the people that immigrated into Rome, they converted en masse to Arianism, and it begins to split the church. And since Constantine had made the Christian church the official religion for the Roman Empire, it's now splitting the Roman Empire. And so Constantine doesn't understand theology, so he orders all the bishops to come to Nicaea to settle the Arian heresy. And they do. It's the first time all the Christian leaders gather together in one place. Constantine foots the bill. There's maybe 500 of bishops and church leaders with about another 1,000 of their staff, so probably 1,500. And they all show up at Nicaea. And the story is that Nicholas was so upset at Arius for starting this first heresy that he slapped him on the face on the floor of the conference. And you can see the artwork there. There's the bishops, and who's down there in the well? That is Arius. And again, there's all the bishops there, and they throw Arius down into the hole. And so here's the picture of Nicholas slapping Arius. And for starting this, Nicholas got reprimanded for it when somebody else had a dream and said, leave Nicholas alone. And here's another famous artwork of St. Nicholas slapping Arius. I was looking for some artwork on the internet for my presentation, and I found this one. Here's a old picture of Nicholas, and it says, "I came to give presents to kids and to punch heretics. I just ran out of presents." Anyway, so the Greeks have lots and lots of stories about Nicholas. Again, he is the most popular. He's like the founding father of the Greek Orthodox Church. And some of these stories are more believable than others. You see in the artwork, there's little pictures around the main picture, and that's all the different stories about Nicholas. A couple I'll highlight. One is there was a famine in the town of Myra, and it being a port city, he goes down and talks some sailors into unloading some of their grain to help his people. And he promises that God will bless the sailors. And sure enough, on their return trip, they said what was left in the hull of their boat multiplied, and they had more than enough. And there's a story in the Bible of Elijah and with a little widow, and she had a meal barrel, and her meal barrel didn't run dry. And another story the Greeks have is that there was a storm, and it being a port city, the fishermen and sailors couldn't get back to the dock. They run and get Nicholas, and he goes and prays, and the sea becomes calm, sort of like Jesus was calming the sea. And then a story of him rescuing some soldiers. And so, by the way, Nicholas also, in addition to being the patron saint of pawnbrokers, he becomes the patron saint of sailors because he calmed the sea. And so he's pictured oftentimes in artwork holding a boat and so forth. And anyway, but Nicholas confronts corrupt politicians. So you know how today you'll maybe see a story of maybe somebody is about to give a testimony about some corrupt politician, and maybe the day before they give the testimony, they're found dead. You know, maybe there's a body count list. Anyway, so there was this corrupt governor, and he was going to execute some soldiers to cover up his corruption. And they run and get Nicholas, and he rushes down to the execution square, breaks through the crowd, grabs the sword out of the executioner's hand and throws it down. And then in front of everybody, he tells them the corrupt stuff the governor was doing. Now, the governor realizes nobody could know all the details except God. And so he realizes his number's up, and he gets down and he begs Nicholas to pray for him that God would have mercy on his soul. So the Greeks have lots and lots of stories about Nicholas, and some are more believable than others. He dies in 343 AD, and then what happens in the church world in a larger sense is you have an emperor Theodosius, and he outlaws paganism. So where Constantine legalized Christianity, Theodosius outlawed paganism, which you think of it, okay, if there's human and blood sacrifice going on and divination and temple prostitutes. So Theodosius also ended the Olympic Games. If you've ever been to Greece, to where they held them, the tour guides will tell you that they ran the races naked and their wrestling matches were naked. They were definitely pagan. And so Theodosius, a change happens because now you have a lot of people that maybe didn't have a spiritual experience, but they're entering the church because it's illegal to not be a Christian. And now you have the official, another heresy, another council to settle it. Another heresy, another council to settle it, another heresy, another council. So pretty soon you have the state-approved belief system. So in 1 century, you go from Christians meeting in catacombs, risking their lives and being caught every now and then and thrown to the lions, very intense and personal and a small group type of thing, to now big marble churches and the state-approved doctrine that everyone has to agree to. Anyway, so then you fast forward to Justinian, and he is like a century and a half after Nicholas, and he is not only the emperor of the Byzantine Christian Empire, he's sort of the last emperor of the East and the West all being together under one leader. He also acts as the de facto head of the Christian church, and that's Emperor Justinian. He built the Hagia Sophia, which today is been turned into a mosque by the Turks, but it's still standing there. He builds a church and dedicates it to Nicholas. And so it's in the town of Myra. Today, that's Demre, Turkey. And this is what Justinian built, the church to Nicholas there. There's still some artwork that's barely visible in the church, which is Nicholas. And but then another addition to the story, Vladimir the Great, Emperor of Russia. He decides to convert to a monotheistic religion. And so he throws the pagan previous Russian gods into the Dnieper River. Word gets out, he's thinking of embracing monotheism. So some Muslim ambassadors show up in Russia. And the first chronicle of Russia, the first court documents of Vladimir, says that Vladimir listened intently when the Muslim ambassadors told them that paradise was filled full of women, because he was fond of women. But then when the Muslim ambassador told them that they could no longer drink alcohol, Vladimir said, "We cannot have this because drink is the joy of the Russes, the Russians." I just think it's sort of humorous that Vladimir didn't convert to Islam because he liked to drink. Well, then some Jews came to Vladimir, and he declined. He said, "Well, you offended your God, and you've been banished from your city of Jerusalem, and why should I follow you again?" And then some Roman Catholics came from Western Europe. But finally, the Greek Orthodox came to Vladimir. And they said, "Look, we've got the largest Christian church in the world, the Hagia Sophia. It was 165 feet high, 102 foot across dome, 4 acres of gold mosaics. If you've ever been there, it's like this enormous cavern." And then they said, "We speak Greek, which is the language of the New Testament." And so they convinced Vladimir that they sort of had a corner on the market when it came to Christianity. So Vladimir converts to the Orthodox version of Christianity, and he adopts Nicholas as the patron saint of Russia. That's why so many churches in Russia are named after Saint Nicholas, and the name Nicholas or Nikolai is such a popular name in Russia. But then we see another transition. So originally he was St. Nicholas of Myra, which is the city there on the southwest coast of modern-day Turkey. But then the Muslims invade. I wrote a whole book called What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran. And so the Muslims attack into Asia Minor, and they have several different waves of Islamic expansion. The first wave conquered Egypt, which used to be Christian, evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel. The Muslims conquered North Africa, which used to have 250 Catholic dioceses along the North Africa, along the coast in the 7th century. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. Today that's Tunisia. In the year 711, 80,000 Muslims invaded Spain and conquered it in 10 years. And then the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Matter of fact, Constantine's mother, St. Helena, went to the Holy Land and built all these cathedrals where she thought Christ's passion took place. And then the Muslims conquered Syria, which was the first country to completely be Christian. Syria was Christian for 6 centuries before Caliph Umar conquered it. Now, that was all the first Arab Spring. It was mostly, Arab, Persian. But then the Turks convert to Islam, and they invade into what is today Turkey. And they would destroy the churches and the libraries and the museums and the artwork, sort of like what they do currently. And so they beg the West for help, and the West sends help. It's called the Crusades. Now, the most popular Greek saint, St. Nicholas, his bones are moved from Myra over to the little church on the east coast of Italy called Bari, B-A-R-I. Still there. There's a cathedral there called Cattedrale Niccolò de Bari, Cathedral of Nicholas of Bari. And so there's the cathedral with the remains of St. Nicholas. And there is a pope that dedicates the cathedral. The pope's name is Urban II. Now, the listeners may not be up on all their pope names, but that is the same Pope Urban II that goes to the Council of Clermont in 1095 AD and begs the West to send help to these Greek Christians that are being killed by the Muslims. And the Catholic West sends help. It's called the First Crusade. So the same Pope that welcomes the St. Nicholas bones from Italy over to Italy is the same Pope that calls for the First Crusade. Anyway, and there's 9 major crusades trying to stop the Muslim crusaders. And now the Muslims have 14 centuries of crusades, and they're still going on to this day. They feel like they have a divine command to bring the whole world into submission to Allah. I thought this was interesting. This was in 2009. This was an article in the Turkish newspaper, Hürriyet Daily. It says, Cultural and Tourism Minister Ertuğrul Gürney, and I know I'm not pronouncing that right, told reporters in Antalya on Sunday that there were plans to demand the return of the bones of Nicholas. So they did not, but nevertheless, they're acknowledging that the bones were taken from what is today Turkey and brought over to Bari, Italy. Now, am I doing okay with the time?
Don't even. I'm telling you this. You can't buy that kind of information. This is wonderful. You just keep rolling.
So now that St. Nicholas is being celebrated in Western Europe, the gift giving that took place on the anniversary of his death, December 6th, right, 343 AD, the gift giving becomes really popular. And it becomes so popular that St. Francis of Assisi feels that it is a distraction from the real reason for the season, that Jesus was born in the manger. So St. Francis of Assisi, around 1223, created the first nativity scene, the creche scene, the Jesus, Mary, Joseph, donkeys in the manger, and so forth. And so if you've ever seen a nativity scene, that goes back to St. Francis of Assisi. He was known for standing up to the opulence of the church in the day, and the poor Franciscans would wear burlap and go barefoot, and they were called preaching friars. And they would go from town to town, preach the gospel. Anyway, now we fast forward to 1517. Martin Luther starts the Reformation. And by this time, there is a saint's day for every day of the year. And the churches are filled with all kinds of relics and statuaries and little chapels to the different saints. And Martin Luther felt like this was a distraction from Christ. So he ends all the saints' days, including the popular St. Nicholas Day. But the Germans liked the St. Nicholas Day and all the gift giving. So Martin Luther says all gifts come from the Christ child, and he moves all the gift giving to December 25th. And the German pronunciation of Christ child is Christkindl. Kindle means child, like kindergarten, kindercare. Kindle means child. Christ means Christ. And so Christkindl, Christ child, over the years got pronounced Kris Kringle. So Kris Kringle is really Christkindl, which means the Christ child. And so that was Martin Luther. Now, December 25th. Why are we picking that date? Well, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the date that was of major interest was the date of the resurrection. It was on the Jewish feast of Passover. And so the Christians would ask the Jews every year, when is Passover this year? And that's when they would celebrate Easter. Anyway, it was not until the 3rd century that you had a Clement and a couple church writers that began to question when the date of Christ's birth was. And so the traditional formula was based on the story of Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, and he's in the temple offering incense, and the description fits the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish year, and it's usually celebrated on September 25th. Now, in the story, Zacharias doubts the angel, and so he's struck dumb and can't talk, and then he goes and his wife Elizabeth conceives. And then we have Mary becoming pregnant by the Holy Spirit, and she visits Elizabeth, and the scripture says that Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant. And so 6 months pregnant means that if the Yom Kippur, that's what it all hinges on. If the Yom Kippur is September 25th, 6 months later would be March 25th. If Mary was brand new pregnant on March 25th, that's the typical date of the what's called Annunciation, when the angel appeared to Mary and announced it to her. And so 9 months after March 25th is December 25th. Did you catch all that? Anyway, that's the traditional formula for December 25th being the date of Christmas.
No, I don't want you to lose your place, but just please, for everybody's edification, please run that by just about the date just one more time, because I'll tell you why later.
So we have in the Bible, there's Zacharias, John the Baptist's dad.
Right.
And he is offering incense in the temple. The angel appears to him. The description of him offering incense in the temple fits what Jews do, the priests do on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which is usually September 25th. His wife Elizabeth gets pregnant, and Mary visits her, and the scripture says that Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant, which makes September 25th, 6 months later is March 25th, and if Mary's brand new pregnant, that means that the baby's born 9 months later, December 25th.
Perfect.
Now, there's also the when Constantine converted and became a Christian, and then when Theodosius outlawed paganism, there was this move to say that Christianity is victorious, and so the dates that used to be having a pagan significance are now getting new meanings. And a little bit of that goes on today. So, for example, a lot of churches on Halloween, they don't want to celebrate the gory pagan stuff. So what do? They'll have a harvest festival. Maybe have the kids dress up as Bible characters. And they'll have a nice, protected environment where the kids can have fun. And so it's this idea that instead of ignoring the date, you supplant it with something that has a new and victorious meaning to it. I was in Assisi back in college, went to school in Italy for a semester, and we were in the middle of town. If you've ever been to Assisi, they still have everything built in 12th century stone. So there's no McDonald's signs out there. It looks exactly the way it did in the 12th century. Really cool. Anyway, the church in the middle of town, the stairs are almost worn away. And the tour guide says, yes, this used to be a pagan temple, but after paganism was outlawed, it was turned into a church. And so it's this thought, why would you tear a church down in the middle of town? Because there's not a whole lot of space on the top of this mountain where Assisi's built. Why would you tear the church down and build another building right in the same place? So they would just, bless it and cast the devils out of it, and they say, okay, we're going to use it. And so that was what they did for dates. And so, yes, some of these dates did have pagan meanings before, but the Christian idea was, let's show that Christianity is victorious, and we're going to supplant whatever meaning was previous. Now, another thing to throw in the mix is we talked about Eastern Europe, Greek Orthodox, Western Europe, Roman Catholic, and they couldn't decide what day was holier. And Western Europe said December 25th, Christmas was the holiest day. Eastern Europe said it was Epiphany, the visit of the three wise men, in Christ being revealed to the world. That's the holiest day. And they couldn't decide which day was holier. So at the Council of Tours in 567 AD, they decided to make all 12 days between December 25th and January 6th, the 12 days of Christmas.
That's beautiful.
So the 12 days are not the 12 days leading up to Christmas. They're the 12 days between December 25th and January 6th. They call them holy days. And over the years, the word holy day got pronounced holiday. And so the people say, well, don't mention Christmas, just say holiday. Well, holiday means holy day. And what are the holy days but the 12 days of Christmas? Anyway, now, Martin Luther, as I mentioned, is the one who is credited for moving all the gift giving from St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, to December 25th. All gifts come from the Christ child. I saw this woodcut. It's where they would carve in wood and then put ink on it, dating back to the 16th century. And I just saw something in this picture that just tickled me. If you look to the side, there's a little boy with what? A crossbow. You can put your eye out with that thing. Remember the little Red Ryder, the BB gun? I mean, little boys like things to shoot. I thought that was sort of funny.
It is.
Anyway, so the story is that Martin Luther was coming home at night and saw the sky twinkling with stars, and he put the tree up and put little candles in the branches and told his kids this was like the sky above Bethlehem on the night of Christ's birth. Now, there's more to the tree and the lights, and I'll just briefly get into that. So Thor is a movie that's popular nowadays. Well, Thor was the Germanic pagan god of thunder, and he's where we get Thor's Day or Thursday. And then there was another pagan Germanic god named Woden, or Odin, and they named a day of the week after him called Woden's Day or Wednesday. Anyway, these are Germanic tribes, and they have their pagan gods, and they would do human sacrifice to these pagan gods, and the sort of blood sacrifices. And so the same way St. Patrick, and I wrote a whole book on him, he drove the Druids out of Ireland, and all their Druid, trick-or-treat Halloween, that came from the Druids. St. Boniface did the same thing with the Germans. And so he is a missionary from Britain, and in around 722 AD, he goes to Germany, and he goes up to Thor's big tree, and he takes an axe, and he chops down Thor's tree. And some people say, well, you can't chop down Thor's tree. And somebody else said, well, if Thor is really a god, he can protect his own tree. And some stories say that a gust of wind came and knocked the tree down at the same time he was chopping it. Anyway, all the pagans decided to reject Thor and reject Odin and convert to Christianity. And the story is that Boniface pointed at a little evergreen tree and said, instead of sacrificing blood to this oak tree, let this little evergreen tree be a symbol of the Christ child. It's evergreen, so it's like eternal life, and it always points toward heaven. And then the triangle shape of the tree he used to explain the Trinity. So just like St. Patrick used a three-leaf clover to teach the Trinity, Boniface used the triangular shape of the evergreen tree. And so he said, your houses are built of fir. It's a sign of endless life. And so they have a town there in Germany with St. Boniface having chopped the tree down, and there's the axe and so forth. The lights at this time of the year, we can't help but notice that they begin with Hanukkah. Around 165 BC is when the Jews drove the Syrians out of Jerusalem, and the temple had been defiled, and they clean out the temple and they want to light the menorah, but there's only enough oil for 1 day, but they pour it in and it burns for 8 days. And so the Jews, from 165 BC, the Feast of the Dedication, every wintertime they light candles. And even Christ, in John chapter 10, it says he was in Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. So even Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. Anyway, so we've got a couple thousand years of lights at this time of year. And so there's the Maccabees, the Jews driving the Syrians out of Jerusalem. And so the thought is that this could have influenced Martin Luther and those who decided to take the candles that they had seen for 1,000 years and put these candles onto the tree branches. So there may have been a little mixing of the Hanukkah traditions with the Christmas traditions. And anyway, now we fast forward to England. Now, Henry VIII brings the Reformation to England, not because he had a spiritual experience. Remember, Martin Luther had a spiritual experience, the just shall live by faith and so forth. Not so with Henry VIII. He just wanted another wife. And the the Pope wouldn't recognize his divorce of Catherine of Aragon, and so he makes himself his own Pope. He goes on to have 6 wives, not a real spiritual type of guy. The Puritans came along and wanted to purify the Church of England. And but during Henry VIII's time, Christmas became a party time. Now, he did bring the Reformation to England. They did de-emphasize the saints and all of the saints' days, and they did stop celebrating and honoring the saints like they had previously. But rather than focusing on the Christ child, the Christkindl, like Martin Luther did, Henry VIII brings back an old Roman holiday. And you have to remember, Britain was a Roman colony. Julius Caesar was the first one to invade Britain. And so the Roman colony of Britain, the Romans had a god named Saturn. And at the end of the year, they had their Saturnalia feast. And Saturn was the god of feasting and plenty and merriment. And if you've ever seen The Christmas Carol with Charles Dickens, there's the spirit of Christmas present. And he's this big guy with robes and a wreath in his hair and a goblet of wine and grapes and so forth. And you're looking at him scratching your head thinking, who is this guy? He sort of looks like Santa, but he also sort of looks like some Roman god. Well, that's who he was. He was Saturn, but they Christianized him and they called him Father Christmas. They couldn't call him St. Nicholas because saints were outlawed after the Reformation. And so anyway, so during Henry VIII's time, Christmas in England became a party time, sort of like Mardi Gras. People forget Mardi Gras used to be a spiritual day. It was the day before Lent, when you would fast 40 days before Easter. Now Mardi Gras is this lewd party in New Orleans. Anyway, that's sort of what happened during Henry VIII's time. Christmas became partying and drinking and wassailing, where they'd take a drink of booze and throw the rest of it on some plant, hoping for a nice harvest the next year, gaming and revelry. Well, the Puritans didn't like that. And the Puritans eventually had a civil war in England. In 1640, they had a civil war, and the Puritans won. And the Puritans outlawed Christmas. And one of the Puritan leaders in New England was Cotton Mather. He said, "Can you in your conscience think that the Holy Savior is honored by mad mirth, long eating, and hard drinking, and lewd gaming, and rude reveling by a mass fit for none but a Saturn or a Bacchus or a night of Muhammad and Ramadan? You cannot possibly think so." So they passed a law in the Puritan New England: "Whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas and the like, either by forbearing labor, feasting, or any other way, upon such an account, every person so shall pay for each offense 5 shillings as a fine to the country." So you were fined for celebrating Christmas in Puritan New England. They said that every day is the same, with Sabbath is our holy day. When the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth, the first boatload of them came over, and they were very strict. And a second boatload of Pilgrims came over, and they liked Christmas. And William Bradford says, well, believing in conscience that we're not going to force people, he went ahead and let the second boatload observe Christmas while everybody else went out to work. And then he said, they come back at lunch and everybody's playing. And he says, it may offend your conscience to work on Christmas, but it offends our conscience to work while you're playing. So if you're going to celebrate it, do it quietly in your house. Anyway, that's a little humorous story there. So this is what the captain of the Mayflower wrote when the Pilgrims first got off their boat, December 25th in 1620. At anchor in Plymouth Harbor, Christmas Day, but not observed by these colonists, they being opposed to all saints' days, etc. A large party went ashore this morning to fell timber and begin building. They began to erect their first house, about 20 feet square, for their common use, and so forth. And then this is the incident I told you about. William Bradford, Christmas Day, governor called the people out to work. As usual, most of the new company excused themselves, said it was against their conscience to work on that day. So the governor told them if they made it a matter of conscience, he would spare them till they were better informed. So he went out with the rest and left them. But upon returning at work at noon, he found them at play in the street, some pitching bars, some at stool ball, and other such sports. So he went on to tell them, took away their games and told them that if it was against his conscience that they should play and others work, if they made keeping the day a matter of devotion, let them remain in their houses, but there should be no gaming and reveling in the streets. So it's a humorous little story. Now, the Dutch. We get our traditions on Christmas from the Dutch. And the Dutch pronunciation of Saint Nicholas is Sant Nicolaas. Sant Nicolaas, Santa Claus. And the Dutch do a take on another theme, sort of going back to the Greeks. Now, people are familiar with the Catholic saying, St. Peter's at the gates of heaven.
Sure.
Well, the Greeks did a take on one of the verses in the book of Revelation, where it says Jesus will return at the end of the world to judge the living and the dead, riding a white horse. And the saints will come back with him, riding white horses. And St. Nicholas is a saint, so he will be one of those riding a white horse. But since he's such a special saint to the Greeks, they have him coming back once a year for a little mini judgment, a little checkup on the kids, make sure they're on the right track. See who's naughty, see who's nice, right? And so in Norway, they didn't have horses, so they had them riding a reindeer. And then the angels kept the Lamb's Book of Life and Book of Works. That turns into the Book of the Naughty and the Nice. And the saints come from where? Heaven, the celestial city, the New Jerusalem. That turns into the North Pole. And the angels turn into the elves and so forth. So in Holland, they continue this tradition, and they have St. Nicholas coming once a year dressed as a saint, as a bishop. And he's riding a white horse. And he's coming from Spain. And Spain was the big Catholic Holy Roman Empire for several hundred years. And in Holland, St. Nicholas has a little helper that comes with him. And his name is Zwarte Piet, Black Peter. And they tell the little Dutch kids that if you're good, St. Nicholas will give you a present, right? He'll look through the book, see if you're naughty, see if you're nice, and they'll give you a present. I like this little kid. He doesn't look too happy. You haven't been a good kid. Now, notice that guy in the background, that sort of strange-looking creature.
Oh, yeah.
They tell the kids in Holland that if you're good, St. Nicholas gives you a present. If you're naughty, Zwarte Piet will take you and put you in a gunny sack and take you back to Spain and sell you into Muslim slavery.
Oh, wow.
And I have a bunch of little brothers. I would have loved to have tormented them with that story. And I was actually doing an interview and talking with some people from Holland. And they said, sure enough, the night before St. Nicholas visited, all the little boys in the neighborhood would make sure to go to sleep at night with a pocket knife in their pocket. And I said, why is that? He goes, that's to cut ourselves out of the gunny sack in case we woke up and we were being taken away. So anyway, so the Dutch had these stories and traditions, and some of them get a little more serious. But so the Dutch settled New Amsterdam, which became New York. And guess what the name of the first Dutch Reformed church is in New Amsterdam? The St. Nicholas Dutch Reformed Church. Okay. It ended up growing into the largest Protestant church in New York. And later they sold the building to the Sinclair Oil Company, who tore it down and built an oil building. And the congregation moved out to the county, and they renamed it the Marble Collegiate Church, which is where Norman Vincent Peale and even Donald Trump went to the Marble Collegiate Church. And remember where I said how St. Nicholas was the patron saint of sailors. And so on the boat that the Dutch took to settle New Amsterdam, supposedly there was a mascot on the front of St. Nicholas. So instead of it being a mermaid or a Poseidon or whatever, it was a St. Nicholas because he was the patron saint of sailors. So they founded the Dutch Reformed St. Nicholas Church in 1642, and it grew. It was at the corner of 48th and 5th Avenue when it became that huge church. But then again, it got torn down and they built an oil building there. But they still have lots of St. Nicholas Dutch Reformed churches in Holland. Some of them are very big. And with the tradition of St. Nicholas visiting once a year, giving out presents. And so these traditions came to New York, New Amsterdam. But he was still a saint. Now, another addition to the story, I've got a couple more pieces to it to bring it to a conclusion. Am I doing okay?
Absolutely.
So Washington Irving We know him because he gave us Rip Van Winkle, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and he wrote Dietrich Knickerbocker's A History of New York from the beginning of the New World to the end of the Dutch dynasty. In there, he uses the name to describe the city, Gotham City, and the name stuck. And his name, Dietrich Knickerbocker, became such a popular book that Knickerbocker got associated with New York. We even have the basketball team, the New York Knicks, right? And so Washington Irving in New York made an impact. Well, while he's describing the Dutch era, he said St. Nicholas visits once a year, riding in his wagon over the treetops, throwing out presents to his favorites. And he describes him dropping the presents down the chimneys and stockings found in the morning mysteriously filled. But he describes Nicholas wearing a typical Dutch outfit of long trunk hose, a leather belt, boots, and a stocking hat. Now, this is a change. He's still St. Nicholas, but he's dressed in a Dutch outfit. And then Washington Irving adds, laying his finger beside his nose, gave a significant look, and then mounting his wagon, he returned over the treetops and disappeared. And so the next installment came in New York. It was an Anglican Hebrew professor named Clement Moore. And he writes a poem for his children in 1823 titled A Visit from who? St. Nicholas. And that is something we're all familiar with. And of course, the first lines, "'Twas a night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care in hopes that St. Nicholas would soon be there. And when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and a tiny reindeer with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. He was dressed in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he flung on his back. He looked like a peddler opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. Droll little mouth drawn up like a bow, the beard of his chin was white as snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. Whoa, where did that come from? When did St. Nicholas take up tobacco? Tobacco came from the American Indians, right? And anyway, he had a broad little face and a round little belly. Shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. A chubby, plump, right, jolly old elf. I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. So now we see that St. Nicholas is shrunk in size. He's the size of an elf, sort of like if you've seen St. Patrick portrayed as a leprechaun. St. Patrick was a missionary that converted 120,000 Druids to Christianity, and they felt like the woods were filled with these spirits. But now St. Patrick is pictured as a leprechaun, right? And so now we see St. Nicholas is shrunk, and stockings filled turns with a jerk, laying his finger aside his nose. Right, got that from Washington Irving. And giving a nod up the chimney, he rose. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all a good night." And now the next installment came during the Civil War. There was a illustrator for Harper's Weekly magazine named Thomas Nast. We know him because he invented the Republican elephant and the Democrat mule for his political cartoons. And Thomas Nast was the first one to put a picture of St. Nicholas addressing the Union troops, right? Sitting on a wagon full of toys. And in the background, you see a flag, and the way on the hill, you see the North Pole sign. And so this was a political jab at the South to say St. Nicholas is associated with the North, right? Prior to this, saints came from heaven, the celestial city, right? New Jerusalem, but now it's the North Pole. But again, it's a political jab.
Wow.
Thomas Nast is also the first one to paint his clothes red. He did a book for the McLaughlin brothers in New York. And late 1800s, you see lots of different variations of St. Nicholas. And the next and last installment is Coca-Cola hired an artist named Haddon Sundblom. We know him because he invented the Quaker Oats man and Aunt Jemima for the syrup, for the pancakes and the pancake flour and so forth. Well, once a year for 30 years, Coca-Cola had artist Haddon Sundblom do a painting of St. Nicholas drinking Coca-Cola. Now he's full grown, ruddy complexion, rosy cheeks, nice huggable grandfather. He's no longer the right jolly plump old elf. And so Coca-Cola invented mass marketing. It's the best known trademark name in the world, Coca-Cola. And so their image of the full-grown Santa is what spread all around the world. And so when we look at the artwork, some of it's really charming, and then I thought this was interesting. It went from the stump of a pipe. Now he's smoking Lucky Strikes. That's sort of funny. Here he is smoking Camels and enjoying a good smoke of tobacco. But anyway, but the Muslims still know that he's a saint, and they actually, here's a story of them killing somebody who was dressed as a Santa. But it all started with a real guy who lived in the 3rd and 4th century named Nicholas, who was a Christian, and he loved Jesus, and he went into the ministry, and he became a bishop, and he was imprisoned under Roman Emperor Diocletian for his faith. And then he was, let out, preached against paganism, and stood up to corrupt politicians and so forth. But then as the Muslims invaded, his traditions went to Western Europe, and they still had him coming once a year, sort of like a mini judgment. And then we see the Dutch added on, and Washington Irving and Clement Moore and Thomas Nast and Coca-Cola. And so underneath of it all, there really was a man who was generous, gave to the poor, and he is somebody that we can emulate and follow his example in giving to the poor and helping them out in their times of need. So Clovis is the king of the Franks, and he is baptized on Christmas Day with 3,000 of his soldiers in the year 496 AD. So this is when France decides to, instead of being some tribe that's wandering in from the east, now settles, and they end up giving the name to the whole geographic area, calling it France. But this is when France becomes Christian, on Christmas Day, 496 AD. And then we have in Christmas Day in the year 597, St. Augustine of Canterbury baptizes 10,000 Anglo-Saxons near Kent, England, on the banks of the Swale Sea inlet by the swampy Isle of Sheppey. The St. Augustine then also baptized King Ethelbert of East Kent. And so this is when England is really evangelized. And then Charlemagne is crowned on Christmas Day in the year 800 AD in the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. It actually was tipping over, so they ended up taking it down and building the Vatican on that spot. But that's the year 800 AD. In 846 AD, 46 years later, 10,000 Muslims invaded Rome and trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's. Anyway, and they trashed the grave of St. Peter, St. Paul. But then in the year 1000 AD, St. Stephen is crowned King of Hungary on Christmas Day. And his son was named Emmerich, and he died at a young man, but nevertheless, he sort of became a patron saint for young men. And the Italian pronunciation of Emmerich was Amerigo, and that was the name given to Amerigo Vespucci, and then continent was named after him, America. So America comes from Amerigo, and Amerigo is the Italian pronunciation of Emmerich, who was the son of St. Stephen. Did you catch that? Anyway, the King of Poland is crowned on Christmas Day. His name was Misko II Lambert on the year 1025 AD. Christmas Day in the year 1066 AD, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England at London's in Westminster Abbey in London. And then in 1492, Christopher Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria, is shipwrecked on Christmas Eve, and he leaves 40 sailors there, and he names the settlement La Navidad, which means the Nativity. And then we have George Washington on Christmas Day evening of 1776. He crosses the Delaware River and captures 1,000 German Hessian troops in Trenton, New Jersey. Next year, in 1777, Captain Cook, the British discoverer of Hawaii, he also discovered the Christmas Island on Christmas Day, where he observed an eclipse of the sun. The War of 1812 ends on Christmas Eve, 1814, with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. And then I found this fascinating. Apollo 8 circles the moon on Christmas Eve in the year 1968. It's the first manned mission to the moon. It enters lunar orbit. They don't land on the moon, but they circle it. And the astronaut Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders broadcast a Christmas greeting. And you can actually get it online and listen to it, but they read the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And then they said, and from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, and a Merry Christmas. God bless all you on the good earth. And then a quote from Harry S. Truman. He lights the national Christmas tree in 1946. Our hopes of future years turn to a little town in the hills of Judea, where on a winter's night 2,000 years ago, the prophecy of Isaiah was fulfilled. Shepherds keeping their watch by night over their flocks heard glad tidings of great joy from the angel of the Lord, singing, Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill toward men. The message of Bethlehem, Truman says, best sums up our hopes tonight. If we as a nation and other nations of the world will accept it, the star of faith will guide us into the place of peace as it did the shepherds on the day of Christ's birth long ago. A couple other things. Patton on Christmas in 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, and he has his chaplain, James O'Neill, compose a prayer for the weather to clear. And on the flip side, they print 250,000 of these cards and distribute them to the soldiers to pray for weather to clear. On the flip side, it has his Christmas greeting. And it says, to each officer and soldier of the 3rd United States Army, I wish a Merry Christmas. Anyway, they win the Battle of the Bulge and free the Bastogne. And Franklin Roosevelt gives a Christmas greeting. It's not easy to say Merry Christmas to you, my fellow Americans, in this time of destructive war. We will celebrate this Christmas Day in our traditional American way because the teachings of Christ are fundamental in our lives, the story of the coming of the immortal Prince of Peace. And then just a reminder that our calendar changed with the birth of Christ, BC to AD. Those that say, well, we want to call it before Common Era and Common Era. Because, okay, when does it change from before Common Era to Common Era? Christ's birth, you really can't get away from it, so you may as well just leave it BC and AD. Clarence Mannion was the dean of Notre Dame Law School, and he was appointed by President Eisenhower to restore to the states powers usurped during FDR's administration. And he's like the founding father of the conservative movement. But Dean Mannion wrote a book in 1951, Keys to Peace, sold 1 million copies. But he writes this regarding Christmas, and I think it's just a great quote. Dean Mannion says, the long march of measured time suddenly stopped, and it did an about-face and started to march in another direction, to a different drum, straight through the ensuing centuries of Christ and Christendom. BC before Christ and AD Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, mark each one of the only reliable milestones along the path of world history. The end of the first time chain and the beginning of the second came together on the night that Christ was born in Bethlehem. The first Christmas Day thus stands as the great divide for the timing and recording of all people, things, and events that have lived and taken place on the earth. The one place on the long, long trail of time where the magnetic needle of history stands vertical and points up. So now, whether he was born exactly in the year 0 or 1 or 3 BC, the fact is that the calendar is based on what assumed was the date of Christ's birth. And interesting quote from Mark chapter 10, the Son of Man came not to serve, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many.